Hello and welcome to the latest Planning Networks for Nature webinar on Heathland birds and how development can affect these important habitats. I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds for people to join. I'm Heather Richards from the RSPB and I'm joined by Mike Coates, who's got a lifetime of experience of working with Heathland sites. It's in his blood, and he is going to share with us lots of exciting information about this fantastic habitat and species it supports. Just a couple of housekeeping points. This session is being recorded, so we will be sharing that on the network afterwards. I know that quite a number of people couldn't make it this evening, so they'll be able to catch up with that afterwards. There is a question and answer button at the bottom, so if anyone has any questions while we're talking, please drop that in that section, and then at the end we'll come to those. If my technological skills are up to it, I should be able to bring people in, so we'll be able to hear from you with your questions. Other than that, I think I'm going to jump straight into it and invite Mike to share his screen.
Okay, well, let's give this a go. Fantastic. Can people see that? Hopefully.
That looks good. If you want to put it in presentation
Good.
mode.
Let's put that in slideshow mode. There we are then.
Fantastic. Over to you, Mike.
Brilliant. Okay, so like it says up there, quick introduction to my favourite habitat, which is lowland heath, the birds, and also some of the challenges. As Heather said, I've done heaths for a long time. I've recently retired after a career of 37 and a bit years, 35 of which I spent on heaths, so kind of makes me either a specialist or a one-trick pony. I don't really know which. So what are we going to be talking about? Quickly run through this. What is a heath, particularly what makes a good heath? How did it get there? Whereabouts is it within our sort of area? Now, speaking to Heather earlier, I understand that is sort of primarily Sussex, Kent, Essex, but if there's people from further afield, hopefully everything that I say will also be relevant to your areas as well. Past management and use, very important for heaths. Then we move on to some of the wildlife, birds, plus some of the other taxa. How do we manage it for nature conservation, disturbance impacts and other threats, and finishing up with, well, why does this stuff matter in the first place? It's a lot to get through, so I will crack on. Definition of a heath. What is a lowland heath? Well, starts off, well, it has to be lowlands. So below 300 metres, 250 metres, something like that. There is a bit of overlap, particularly sort of Dartmoor, Exmoor, North Yorkshire moors to a certain extent, where there's a bit of a kind of a transition phase where it goes up onto the boring moorland stuff. It needs to be a predominantly open landscape. If it's got lots of trees all over it, it's many things, but it's not a heath. Very importantly, a mosaic of vegetation types. Heaths ought to be a bit of a mess, really. I think that's part of the reason I love them so much. Heather needs to be there. The heathers and dwarf gorse need to make up at least 25% of the area. But there has to be some other stuff in there as well. You need some scrub and woodland. You need some grassy bits. You need other flowering plants. You need lower plants, lichens, mosses, that kind of stuff. Bare ground. There has to be some bare ground in there because so many species depend on bare ground, and I'll come back to that later. Heathlands often have impeded drainage, so you'll often find mires, pools, bits of bog, nice wet flushes. Very important feature. And structure is key. What do I mean by structure? Well, basically you mean tall bits and short bits. So you've got that mosaic of types, but you don't want all of your heather to be the same height. You want some short areas and some taller, older areas. You don't want all your gorse scrub to be the same age. You need younger stuff and some older stuff. You don't want all your scrub to be the same age. You need a mixture of different heights of each of those different kind of habitat subtypes. Got all that together and you've got something that approximates to a half decent heathland. Very importantly, heaths are confined to low nutrient and acidic poor soils. That can be on sands, it can be on gravels, it can be on peaty soils. But the important thing is very low in nutrients and acidic. And that just sort of is a pictorial representation of everything that I've just said. So you've got all your various subhabitats, your components. A good heath should have as many of those as possible. And that is an issue because obviously a lot of our heathland sites are quite small now, but I'll come back to fragmentation later. Okay, so whereabouts are they within the patch that we're thinking about? Kent. Well, Kent does still have some heath. There's heath at Blean, there's heath around Pembury, there's Hothfield Common, which is a really nice Kent Wildlife Trust site. Got some very nice wet bits, so I'm told. There used to be a lot more heath in Kent. All along sort of North Kent used to be a heathy ridge starting in Blackheath, back when Blackheath used to be Kent, going all the way out to Dartford through places like Bexley Heath. There are clues in the names. Unfortunately, there isn't any heath left. Dartford Warbler was first scientifically collected, i.e. shot from a heath at Dartford. The important thing from a Kent perspective is some of these heathland species can use other habitats as well. Sussex still has quite a lot of heathland. You've got the high-weald heaths in East Sussex, places like Chailey, Ashdown Forest, and then you've got the weald and greensand heaths, which I must admit are the ones I'm probably most familiar with. So you've got places like Stedham, Iping, and then you go further round up to the very northwest corner of Sussex, and you've got Blackdown, Chapel Common, places like that. Essex is quite an interesting story. Almost lost heathland in Essex. It was down to only about 50 hectares at the turn of this century. There has been some work done. There's now about 50 heathland patches, many of them quite small, but they are there, centred around Epping Forest. But there is a band of kind of sandy soil, sandy sandstone that stretches out from Epping up towards Chelmsford, and there are still a few small heathland pockets there, and more are planned as part of the kind of nature recovery strategy. There used to be more heath in North Essex, the sort of, well, the Essex half of Constable country. Constable did quite a few paintings around the Suffolk side, around East Bergholt, but there used to be a comparable area of heathland on the other side of the River Valley in North Essex. But again, sadly, that's all gone now. So that's where it is. How did it get there? Well, that's a very good question. There's been lots of discussion around how much of the UK was actually open habitat before the influence of farming communities. The traditional model was wildwood. The entire country was a great big wood, except for maybe tops of the cairngorms poking out the top, and a squirrel, as Tansley said, could have travelled from Land's End to John O'Groats without ever touching the ground. That theory didn't leave much room for open habitat species. Vera came along with another model, which was much more dynamic, mixture of open ground, scrub, mature woodland, constantly shifting both in time and space, driven by the impact of large grazing animals. The honest answer is we don't know. We don't know what Britain looked like before the arrival of agricultural communities. However, what we do know is that heather pollen never completely disappeared. It varied in terms of how much there was in the pollen record, but it never disappeared. And we also know that a lot of heathland specialists, things like sand lizard, smooth snake, these things, they can't have crossed the English Channel by themselves. They were here before the land bridge disappeared, and they've stayed ever since. So if these open habitat species have been present for a very long time, it stands to reason that their habitat has also been present for a very long time. So I think we can say that there's always been some heath. How much is a matter for debate. What we do know is the area of heathland massively increased as a result of human activity once we invented agriculture, because you can't grow wheat in a wood. So our farming ancestors cleared the woodland, farmed it. They didn't know much about nutrient preservation or enriching soils. Nutrients were soon leached away. Soils became poorer and poorer, and eventually they became ideal for heathers. And people then managed that area as pasture, creating heathland, which spread as our ancestors moved on, cleared more woodland, exhausted more soil, heather came in, and so on and so forth. And heathland probably reached its maximum extent around about 1750, the late 18th century. At that time, we know from Roke's map, and I'll just give an illustration from Surrey here. Roke's map was published in 1763. The first ever OS map was published 1816. So around about the late 18th century, we can say that there's probably about a fifth of the county was heathland. That has now shrunk to about 2%. There was vast amounts of heath. And they were used. They were used by people throughout that time, from the Bronze Age right the way through. From the Norman Conquest onwards, most heaths were common. Common is one of those words that people don't, well, is often misunderstood. I've heard people tell me that commons don't belong to anyone, or that commons belong to everyone, or that commons belong to the Crown. Point of fact, commons are private property over which people other than the owner have certain rights to use them. And it's that constant usage that helped maintain it as low nutrient status soil. Vitally important from a heathland perspective. There were 6 commoners' rights. One of them is the right of grazing. Commoners could turn animals out onto their common, onto the heath. Traditionally, heathland grazing involved taking animals out from the farm onto the heath in the morning and then bringing them back in the evening. That was really important because the cows would come back to the farmyard, they would defecate in the farmyard, and that manure was then used to enrich the fields, but that took nutrients off the heath and transferred them to the farm. Another right of common, the right of estovers, which basically means you can just go and cut bits down, take them home and burn them. I don't think child labour would be encouraged these days, but it was very widespread. Gorse was cut, scrub was cut. Places bracken was used as part of estovers as well. But again, all this material was cut and then removed from the heath and taken back to the home. So again, nutrients were taken off the heath. Turbary, that was a third right of common. Don't really think about heath fires, turf fires in southern England, but turf was still being cut in southern England well into the middle of the 20th century. When I first moved to heaths in Surrey, I was talking to some of the local landowners, and they'd moved into their farm in 1945. And when they moved in, one of the outbuildings was stacked from floor to the roof space with cut turf that had been put aside for fuel. So that was in the middle of the 20th century in the heart of southern England. And again, when you're cutting turf, you took all of the vegetation, you took all of the kind of root layer, you took all of the organic material, and you took all of the nutrients out, and you took them back to the farm and burnt them. There were other rights of common as well. Pannage, put pigs out, don't see that so much, except in the New Forest. Piscary, which was the right to take fish, doesn't really have much impact for what we're talking about. And the right of common in the soil, which meant you could dig bits up and take it away if you needed sand or gravel. That was quite important because it created bare ground. People used it for other things as well. This is collecting bracken. Bracken was used a lot for animal bedding. So again, material taken off the heath, taking nutrients with it. They used it for other things as well. That's a broom squire. in Surrey, round about 1900. What you see there is there's a huge pile of cut heather just behind his kind of lean-to shelter there. And then further back and to the left, just in front of the house, there's several stacks of cut birch. All that material is taken off the heath. And as that material comes off, yes, it helps to maintain a very open landscape. Yes, it helps to maintain structure because he's cutting all the tall heather and that'll come back. So you've got patches of short heather, you've got patches of cleared scrub. That scrub will regrow. You've got some structure in your scrub. And of course, nutrients are being taken off. And then this kind of use inadvertently created what we've previously described as a really good bit of heath. Unfortunately, it couldn't last forever. In the 19th century, we worked out that if you chucked enough lime and fertilizer on these poor soils, you could turn them into slightly better farmland. So we did, lots of it. The Industrial Revolution meant, and the coming of railways, meant that people didn't need to cut turf so much. They could get coal much more easily for much less effort. So heaths became less important. And if they're less important, there was less need to protect them, less need to preserve them. In the 20th century, forestry took off thanks to the 1919 Forestry Act. Forestry Commission was set up and they promptly afforested something like, well, more than 50,000 hectares of lowland heath. I'm currently speaking to you from Suffolk, where I've moved to. Just down the road from us, there's Thetford so-called Forest, which was established on 22,000 hectares of what had been very nice Breckland heath. Also, after World War II, of course, there was a massive push for agricultural intensification, meant more heath was lost. Commoning as a way of farming became unviable, so largely disappeared. Obviously, Ashdown, it still exists, and obviously New Forest, but it's largely gone. And there was massive urban expansion, though throughout the 20th century, there was massive urban expansion. So all in all, more than 80% of our heaths have gone since 1800. Of course, as the Joni Mitchell song says, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. As we realised we'd lost so much of it, the bits we had left became more important from a nature conservation point of view. And we started to sort of focus some of our conservation efforts on our remaining heathland. Now, I already mentioned that forestry was one of the drivers in the loss of heathland. But it's an important point that some of the heathland species can survive reasonably well in reasonable numbers in rotational forestry. If you've got a big area of forestry that's managed on rotation so that you've always got some areas that have been recently replanted, so the trees are very young, probably less than 5 years old, something like that. Those young plantations will support some of those heathland birds. And obviously, again, as it goes round on rotation, you fell bits, replant, there's always going to be patches within that extensive forestry where there will be opportunities for some of these heathland specialists. Similarly, in extensive areas of chestnut coppice, and that's particularly important in Kent because Kent doesn't have that much heathland as we saw, but historically it's had some quite extensive forestry plantations around Bedgebury, and of course a lot of extensive sweet chestnut coppice, which managed on rotation could support some of these heathland species. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that Kent currently has something in the region of sort of 25, 35 pairs of nightjar, and most of those are associated with either coppice or plantation, primarily coppice. Right, let's move on to some of those bird species. Now, this is nightjar, my favourite, to be honest. I fell in love with heaths when I heard my first nightjar, and I just stood there like a gormless idiot with my jaw hanging open, listening to churring and thinking, this is the most ridiculously brilliant thing I've ever heard. Like I say, fell in love with heaths there and then, never really wanted to work on anything else. Nightjars are a summer visitor. They nest on the ground. That's a very important point. They feed on nocturnal insects, and the song is called Churring. For those of you who've never heard it, please, please, please come late May, early June, make an effort to get out to some heathland or indeed to a big conifer plantation and listen. And it's a fantastic noise. It sounds a bit like, it's the best way to describe it, cross between a distant outboard motor and a very happy cat. Fantastic. They nest in mature heather, in small gaps within mature heather, but they do like to have a few trees about on their heaths that they use as song perches. They range quite widely. They travel quite away from the heaths to feed, that they do also feed over their heaths. Again, they are a species that will utilise young conifer and recently cut coppice. Population, well, figures are quite old now, but they haven't changed that much as far as I'm aware. Woodlark, gorgeous little bird, much rarer than nightjar, uses its heaths at the opposite end, if you see what I mean. It needs very short vegetation and bare ground. It just wanders about and picks up insects as it goes along. Again, it will use those very young forestry plantations, providing they're on suitable soil. Has to be quite sandy soil because they make a little scrape for their nest. So if it's too stony, it's not brilliant for them. But sandy, they will use. They do start breeding very early. Eggs can be laid in late February, but March is more typical. And again, it's a ground nester. So, you know, it is prone to disturbance. Again, we'll use young forestry plantations. Populations given there is about 2,300. When I first got involved in heaths back in the late 80s, 1988, there was a population survey for woodlark, found 242 pairs across the whole of the UK. So we've done quite well. We've got them up from 242 to 2,300, maybe a few more. So we put a naught on the end. It's still a very small number. The last of what could be thought of as the big three heathland species, all of which are specially protected under both British and European law, is the Dartford Warbler. Now that is a heathland specialist. You very rarely find that in young plantations, except where those young plantations are on former heathland sites and you've still got quite a bit of heather within the young plantation block. They have to have mature heath and ideally with decent gorse scrub. And decent gorse scrub from a Dartford's point of view is something that is tight and compact and dense and relatively young, so sort of 5-10 years old, that kind of stuff. But it needs that structure of tight, dense gorse. And the reason for that is because, well, basically it's a resident, and in hard winters, it needs the shelter that the gorse provides. And in the centre of one of those gorse clumps, it can be 5 degrees warmer than it is outside. So that gorse is crucial for Dartford Warbler winter survival. Again, it doesn't nest on the ground, but it nests very close to the ground. Feeds on inverts, feeds its young on inverts. Particularly fond of spiders, which is, if you're an arachnophobe, Dartford Warblers are your friend. There are other species that are also associated with heathland in the southeast. Tree pipit, unfortunately, this is one that is declining, both in terms of population and range, but it is still found on some of the heaths. Ashdown Forest, for example, still has tree pipits. Some of the other Sussex heaths do. Not sure about the situation with tree pipit in Kent, but it certainly is associated with heathland in Sussex and Surrey and other parts of the south. Stonechat again, gorgeous little bird actually. When I used to give talks, people used to say, "Oh, British birds are so dull and brown and boring." So he just used to show them a picture of a male stonechat and say, "No, they're not. They're really not. They're gorgeous." Again, it's relatively common, this one, but it is vulnerable to hard weather because it's not a migrant, it hangs around. There was a run of hard winters, sort of 2088, that should say 2008. Typo there, sorry. But yeah, round about 2008, 2012, we had a run of hard winters, and that did severely hammer, stonechat numbers in some parts of the country. The thing about heath is because it is a mix and it's got a lot of other sort of sub-habitat types, it can support populations of other red list species that you normally think of as being found on other habitats. So you can support things like linnet and yellowhammer, which are often thought of as being birds of farmland. But if you've got your scrub and your gorse, you will often find those on heathlands as well. Willow warbler, usually thought of as a woodland species, but really it's a scrub bird. It likes scrub. So if you've got your scrub right on a heath with sort of scrubby margins and patches of scrub out in the middle, you may well find yourself supporting reasonable numbers of willow warbler as well. And redstart, I just put that one in the mix. That's definitely a woodland species, but in the southeast, it does seem to have an association with woodlands close to or adjacent to or on heathlands or former heathland sites. Go to Sussex. Ashdown is a classic site in East Sussex. The woods around the Wealden Heaths tend to be where you support them. I think in Essex, Epping, which by strange coincidence is where your heaths are, is also where your redstarts are. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's the case. And I know from my own experience in Surrey, the concentrations of redstarts are on the woods on the western heaths, whether that's the greensand heaths around Thursley or the Thames Basin heaths up around Ash and Purbright. Not sure the reason for the association, but there is definitely an association. Heaths are kind of famous really because they're the only habitat where you'll find all 6 native reptiles. So you've got the 4 so-called common reptiles: viviparous lizard, slow worm, adder, and grass snake. Unfortunately, they're not really that common anymore. Both viviparous lizard and adder in particular populations are declining, but heathland is still the core for their distribution. And of course, heath's the only habitat where you'll find the rarer ones, sand lizard and smooth snake. There are both of these certainly in Sussex, West Sussex at least, and there are historic records for sand lizard in Kent, not on the heaths, but on the coastal dunes. It would be nice to think they could perhaps be reintroduced at some stage. Sorry, Essex, there's not been any records in your patch at all. It would be nice to get sand lizards back into Kent, wouldn't it? And there are a lot of heathland, invertebrates associated with heathland. I mean, I could talk for a very long time about it, but I won't. I've just picked 3 examples, and I've picked them because they illustrate the importance of different parts of that heathland mosaic. So the top one is a bee wolf, Phalanthus triangulum. It's actually got a honeybee with it. Like a lot of solitary bees and wasps, they burrow into bare sand and then provision the tunnel with, in their case, honeybees, but some of the wasps will use spiders, some of them will use caterpillars. The solitary bees will pack it with pollen, and then they'll lay their eggs in there, and that's where their young will develop. In the case of the bee wolf there, it'll hatch and it'll eat the paralysed bees. Note that the bees are paralysed; they're not dead. So it's fresh meat for the young wasp. But there's a whole bunch of species that are utterly dependent on that particular habitat within the heath. The blue butterfly is silver-studded blue. That likes short heather, but it also needs some slightly taller heather around because that's where the flowers are going to be. Its caterpillars eat young heather shoots, so you need a mixture of heath. And there's plenty of the young stuff, but you also need enough of the heather that's a bit more mature, so mature enough to be flowering. It needs to be quite hot and open because this butterfly is in a symbiotic relationship with a species of ant, and the ant needs hot, conditions on the heath. So it's no point just trying to manage just for the butterfly. You have to manage for the ant as well. Otherwise, you won't get the butterfly. The other butterfly is the grayling, and that needs a completely different kind of heathland habitat. It needs grassier areas, particularly fine-leaved grasses, things like sheep fescue, bristlebent, a bit of bare ground. The important thing for grayling is it needs to be hot. They really like a very hot microclimate. Very well camouflaged. You don't see them that often unless you're really looking for them. And very often they'll fly up onto a tree. And as you can see from that one, when they're up against a tree, it's hard to spot them against the bark. But that's just a little subset. Heaths support a lot of specialist invertebrates, and each of those little heathland sub-habitat types will have their own specialities. Botanically, well, I am a heathland fan, but I have to admit most of the botanical interest is found in the wet bits. And there's just a couple of examples there. You've got carnivorous plants such as the sundew, which is the one there with the red stems with the blob of sticky glue on the end that they use to entrap insects, which they then dissolve and to get the nutrients, because heaths are very nutrient poor. And the other thing there is quite a scarce thing now, that's a marsh club moss. Very scarce, unfortunately, associated with damp, peaty areas on some of our lowland heaths. So that's some of the goodies that you can get on a heath. How do we manage heathlands for conservation these days? General aims: maintain that mosaic of habitat subtypes, ensure a variety of structure for each of those subtypes. Very importantly, keep taking nutrients off and out of the system. Grazing is key. Most conservation grazing schemes aren't as good as the traditional schemes because we don't take animals on, take them off at night. We tend to just basically put them out and leave them there. It's not as good, but you can manipulate their grazing to a certain extent. If you put water and mineral blocks within an area of woodland, then the cattle will spend a disproportionate amount of their time within that woodland, and they'll be defecating there. So there is a small transfer of nutrients from the heath to that woodland area. And of course, there is also a small transfer of nutrients when the animals go off to the abattoir at the end of their lives. To maintain your structure within the heath, you want to cut bits, you want to mow bits. Very importantly, you do need to remove those arisings. I don't see it so much now, but when I first got involved in heaths, a lot of places were just cutting and leaving, which is the worst possible thing to do because the nutrients just build up. So you cut it, you remove the arisings. It would be lovely if there was a market for them, but there isn't. So most heaths you will find somewhere, you will find a disposal area at the edge of the wood somewhere with vast piles of dumped material. But again, the key thing is to try and get it off the heath. Scrub, well, scrub's actually it's one of those things, can be a mixed blessing. You want some scrub up to about 15 years old. You want it less than that. You want a variation in their height. Ideally, you don't want more than 15% scrub across your heathland. It is useful. There are inverts associated with it. You need this rotational management. So you go in and you cut one block one year, you cut another block the next year, and so forth, so on and so forth. Importantly, remove arisings. You don't ever want to eliminate scrub because it's important, but you do need to keep it within a reasonable kind of level. The exception to that is if you're talking about non-native invasive scrub, things like rhododendron, gaultheria, cherry laurel, turkey oak. There, let's just say you manage with extreme prejudice with the aim of getting rid of it. Not always easy, but that's what you need to aim for. Gorse is absolutely key. We mentioned that for Dartfords. Dartfords don't like really old, tall, leggy stuff, doesn't provide any shelter, it doesn't provide much habitat for much else, although yellowhammers will use it, so you don't want to get rid of all of it. old gorse is also a significant fire risk. So you want to manage your gorse. So you want to go in and cut that on a rotation, probably about 10 years. Used to be 10 to 15, but a combination of climate change and nutrient enrichment basically mean that things are growing faster. So probably cut on kind of a 10-year rotation if you can, because you want that really compact, dense structure, because that is what's ideal for a lot of the heathland specialists. Fortunately, gorse at that age responds very well. It coppices from its rootstock very happily. If it's older, it tends not to, but it will come back from seed. Again, try and remove arisings wherever possible. Nutrients again. Bare ground, absolutely vital. Most heaths in the 21st century have nowhere near as much bare ground as there used to be in, say, the 19th century. We talked about turf cutting, one of the rights of common. People used to have to cut an awful lot of turf. It's been estimated that each household would need something like 5,000 turfs every winter. Each turf was about 30 centimetres by 45. 5,000 of those cut. Wow. For each household, every year. That's not taking into account anybody who was exercising that right of common in the soil, or the bare ground created by the cart tracks where people were going out in order to collect the bracken or the estovers or whatever. Not to mention the areas of heavily trampled bare ground where the cattle congregated. Bare ground used to be really, really abundant. And even on heaths that are managed for conservation now, it's nowhere near as abundant. And surprisingly enough, a lot of the species associated with bare ground are now much rarer than they used to be. What is ideal is to have lots of small scale features. Great big tracks like you see in the bottom left there are probably less than ideal, better than nothing, but less than ideal. Lots of small patches is probably best. Tends to work better if you allow them to revegetate and then create new ones. Just again, do it on kind of a constantly rolling pattern. You do some in one patch one year, do some in another patch the next year, just keep going round. Please, however, always check with your archaeologist. They really don't like it if you decide to put a bulldozer across a scheduled ancient monument. I'm not really joking. I can think of at least one nature conservation NGO that thought, oh, there's a nice mound with a south-facing slope. It'd be really good to put some bare sand in there. So they did. Turned out it was a scheduled tumulus. They got into a spot of trouble. So always check with your archaeologist to make sure you're not going to track anything important. Bracken control. Bracken can spread. It can be a problem. Control these days is a tricky one. We used to have a chemical that we could use, Azulox. That's no longer licensed. Other ways of managing it where you can cut it and roll it. The problem with that is you cut everything else. So where you've got bracken spreading out into your heather stand, you cut it, well, you're also cutting your heather. That may or may not be an issue depending on what your priorities are for that particular part of the site. You also have an issue of disturbance because to cut or roll, you need to go and do it at least twice a year for about 5 years. So you've got a lot more in the way of management operations going on. One of the things that is currently being looked at is whether you can tweak it by adjusting the grazing regime, because bracken really does not like being trampled. There's also been trials using pigs, and pigs will eat bracken rhizomes. They will eliminate your bracken, but they will also potentially damage a lot of other stuff. And pigs are omnivores. So yes, they'll eat your bracken rhizomes, but they'll also eat any reptiles they come across, and they'll also eat any the eggs of any ground nesting birds that they come across. Where we're going to go with bracken, I have to say, at the moment the jury is still out, but we are looking at, conservationists in general are looking at kind of tweaks to the grazing regime to see if that can make a difference. I've been banging on about nutrients. Why have I been banging on about nutrients? Well, essentially, all of our heaths are being fertilised. Something in the region of 19 hectares, no, sorry, 19 kilos of nitrogen is falling per hectare per annum. That's the result of some work that was done at Thursley in Surrey. So there's a lot of nutrients falling out the sky. As the heaths become richer, so the vegetation can change. Increase in nitrogen could lead to an increase in grass and bracken. An increase in phosphorus leads to promotion of birch. And pine, well, if you're not managing your heaths and you're not taking material off, you're getting a build-up of organic material and litter. Pine loves that, so you're going to get more of an issue with pine scrub. Nutrients are key. We do not want to get to the situation in this country that they found themselves in the Netherlands. Now, admittedly, in the Netherlands, some of their heaths were receiving something like 500 kilos per hectare per annum. Ridiculous. And a lot of the heaths had actually turned to grass over time. So the Dutch were forced to literally take modified potato harvesters, actually, and turf strip on an industrial scale, took off all of the vegetation, took off all of the organic soil layers, went right back down to bare sand, and that was the only way they could get heathland, heather heathland, back. We don't want to get to that situation, so we need to be continuously removing nutrients via our management. Another threat to our heaths is shrinking patch size and fragmentation. Historically, we had a lot more heath and it was in big chunks. We now have something like 60,000 hectares or so in England, in over 3,000 patches. The average patch size is only 19 hectares. Any assessed that you need 30 hectares really to be minimally viable, but that is to support the full range of heathland things. Even a smaller patch can be valuable. It can support some of those key heathland species. The problems associated with small patches are, well, you get a lot more generalist species around the edge. Yeah, heathland specialists are confined to the middle. So if you've only got a small patch, those heathland specialists are competing with the generalists around the edge. Small patches make it harder for species to move around in response to climate change, and of course, small patches tend to be more expensive to manage because you can't rely on any economies of scale. So fragmentation, yep, is a threat. Climate change is a threat. We're seeing a lot of droughts. A lot of heather dies in droughts. You hope it comes back, but it might not. It might come back as grass, depending on the nutrient status. There's a lot more risk of fire. Rainfall, a lot of those wetter areas, they need fairly steady kind of wetness, if you see what I mean. And what they're going to be getting instead is dry in the summer and massive inundations in the winter. That's not going to help them. Fact is, a lot of heathland species are at the northern edge of their range here. Some of them may actually have slight benefit. Dartford Warbler, for example, will probably move up the hill. So what is now moorland will become suitable habitat for Dartfords. But for a lot of heathland species, I think it's going to be more of a problem than an opportunity. Again, there's that whole connectivity issue, the ability for things to move about. And again, it's linked with that fragmentation of patch size issue. A lot of species can be moved around, but they're going to need a bit of help. You've got things that aren't very good at travelling long distance, things like field cricket and sand lizard. And frankly, translocation is going to be an important weapon in the conservation arsenal for those species. Get to the stage where your conservationist best friend could be a bucket to move these things around.
Just to give you a bit of a prompt, Mike, about time.
That's fine, thanks. Recreational pressure, that's a key one. There's been a lot of work done on that. Looking at Dartfords, essentially, where there's a lot of recreational pressure, a lot of disturbance, they basically get put off nesting. They don't basically get their little feathered bum on the nest until later. So the date at which they start incubating gets pushed back. That has impacts because they miss the key provisioning period for finding food for those chicks, and they have less time for the second brood. That effect is very strong in relatively poor quality territories that are dominated by heather. Where there is really good gorse scrub, we've mentioned that a few times, there's very little difference. Where the territory has got a lot of, is dominated by dwarf gorse, there is also a delay. I think it's simply because people and dogs don't like wandering about too much through really dense gorse. With woodlarks, it's slightly different. They avoid areas with a lot of recreational disturbance. There's a slight twist in that they get fewer pairs on disturbed sites, but each of those disturbed pairs can be more productive because there's less competition with other pairs of woodlarks. However, what the research says is that that slight positive impact isn't sufficient to offset the negative impact of the fact that the habitat just supports fewer pairs in the first place. So it's a different mechanism, but ultimately same result, more disturbance, fewer birds. Nightjars again. Now nightjars don't flush easily. They stay sat really tight, but when they are disturbed, their eggs are vulnerable because they're white and they show up like a sore thumb. What you find is fewer nesting attempts closer to urban areas, basically because we think close to urban areas, more people, more disturbance. What happens is the birds get flushed and then the eggs get predated. Heather, this is one of yours.
It is indeed. Yeah, so Mike's helpfully covered some of the impacts on birds, but there is a multitude of issues with development close to heathland habitats, many of which Mike has covered through other things, but fragmentation, obviously, that loss of connectivity, smaller patch size, predation, both in terms of birds getting disturbed and being more vulnerable to avian predation and mammal predation, but also direct predation from things like dogs and the menagerie that people bring with them. Roads, direct mortality on birds, increased noise and light levels. And one of the key ones is recreational disturbance. So as Mike was explaining with the species associated with heathlands, this is a really important issue. Also things like trampling, vandalism, the issue of eutrophication and contamination. So houses close to heathland sites, people dumping garden waste and invasive species and a whole range of things that will alter the habitat. And things like increased fire risk, more people thinking barbecues are a good idea in dry conditions, etc. And I think there's a whole host of examples that I'm sure Mike could draw on of fires on heathlands, but also the limitations on management as well. So, people not wanting cattle in areas and, cutting fences because they want to walk that way, etc. So basically, more development around these sites means more difficulty managing the site and changes for the habitat and the species it supports in a negative way. If you could click us forward, Mike.
Okay.
And so there's a wealth of research done on this, and as a result of that, there was a need from the driven by the habitat regulations. So the site, a lot of our heathland is protected, as Mike mentioned, so special protection areas, sites of special scientific interest, but particularly driven by the European sites. It's necessary to make sure that new development, both alone and together, is not going to have an impact on this really important habitat. It was seen that development is going to propose that risk, and therefore a strategic mitigation package came forward. Now, Thames Basin Heaths, which covers Surrey, Hampshire and Berkshire, these sites were the ones where this was kind of driven forward initially. The strategy came in 2009. And basically, it's a combination of preventing development very close to these sites. So there's a 400-metre buffer, which is largely driven by the inability to sort of displace recreational pressure. So people that close to these sites are going to use these sites for recreation, and also the roaming distances of pet cats, in terms of predation risk. And then the other area is this wider zone of influence, which means new development in these areas can go ahead, but mitigation is required to address these urbanisation pressures. And that's largely in some form of strategic access management and monitoring strategy, which basically means wardens engaging with people to make them value the sites, understand the habitat, and so that hopefully when they are enjoying these sites, they're doing it responsibly. So keeping their dogs to the tracks, understanding fire risk, and being particularly careful in the times when the Dartford Warblers, Nightjar and Woodlark are likely to be around. And then the other component is green space. So putting attractive, more robust habitats close to these new developments so that people can exercise their dogs off leads and enjoy space for particularly dog walking, in addition to or instead of the vulnerable, fragile heathland sites where dog issues are particularly a problem during the nesting season. And so Thames Basin Heaths was the kind of leader of this kind of approach, but then we've seen similar being evolved on the Wilden Heaths through Heathland Reunited, led by the South Downs National Parks. Obviously, that's relevant to Sussex, and also around Ashdown Forest. So again, relevant to Sussex. But these principles of the kind of impacts that are likely from new development close to these important habitats or sites that support, for instance, Nightjar in Kent, are still valid. So obviously, if you're faced with housing development close to, obviously most of the big patches of remaining heathland are benefit from some kind of designation, but small patches that don't, these kind of principles still apply. So raising concerns about development and the risk that is posed by this development, and also, pushing for the kind of mitigation that might be able to kind of address that. So whether it be some kind of access management to stop new residents creating an issue, or some kind of education program to make sure it's understood how vulnerable these sites are to that kind of activity.
Okay.
I think it's over to you for a final wrap.
Just a bit of a sum up, really. Well, why is Heathland important? Does it matter? I mean, historically, it's always regarded literally as the waste of the manor. Lots of people have written about heaths, not all of them liked heaths very much. William Cobbett rode around southern England and described Heathland as appalling stuff. However, we think it's important because it's a habitat that's restricted to parts of Europe. 20% of the world's heath is found in the UK, so we've got an international obligation to look after this stuff. It's stuffed full of protected species, both under EU law, but also under UK law at the minute, at least. We have our own little piece of legislation, Section 41, the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006, that listed 946 species of principal importance for the conservation of biodiversity in England, i.e. the important ones. Get these saved, and things are in generally good nick. They're referred to just as Section 41 species. 150 of those Section 41 species are dependent on heath. That's more than for any other habitat. So this stuff is really important for those species of principal importance for the conservation of biodiversity in our country. There's also a lot of cultural history as well. Just a couple of examples. Thomas Hardy, Return of the Native, set on heaths in Dorset. The heath's almost like another character in the book. It's there. It's embedded in it. It's embedded in our language. When Christianity first came to this country, it was largely a religion of the urban elite. The people who living out in the boonies, out on the heath, they never heard of it, which is why they were still called heathens. It's embedded in our language, in our culture, and there's a huge amount of surviving archaeology on heathlands, because surviving heaths have probably never been ploughed since the Bronze Age, so there's going to be vast amounts of stuff out there. So yeah, please, you're going to put bare ground in, do check. And it might sound contradictory, bearing in mind what we've been talking about with access and disturbance, but for a lot of people, heaths are where they want to be able to go to access nature, and that is crucially important for all of us. And I just finish with that. That's the end of me wittering. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we're open for some questions. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. And as always, great to hear your insight on Heathland and your experience of managing Heath. Now, we have a question which was, is there any danger of losing more Heathland because of future relaxation of planning legislation? I mean, I think yes would be my initial thinking, because I think we have quite a lot of concerns around the sort of safeguards of the potential planning and infrastructure bill changes, particularly around how that's likely to affect protected sites and species. I think obviously there's still various revisions happening, but I think not just Heathland, but any protected site, I think there's still we still have concerns around the safeguards of those. I mean, Heathland specifically, I suppose the main thing that obviously why there's such a wealth of information on the sort of urbanisation pressures of development is, like Mike was saying, it's in very close proximity to these sort of urban areas, hence why the fragmentation and everything else. So I would have thought, compared to maybe some other habitat types, there's a lot of pressure on Heathland, maybe more so than others for development. But I think it remains to be seen what that risk is in terms of what's going to come forward, in terms of what the final look of the planning and infrastructure bill is going to look like. I think that was the only submitted question we have, but what I'll do is open it up to anyone who would like to ask a question. If you want to raise your hand, I should be able to bring you in. Can also see that Murray is on the call, so I don't know if you wanted to say anything, Murray, about the Nightjar surveys more specifically. Waiting for any questions on Murray to respond. While I'm just seeing if anyone has any further thoughts, I will just mention that we've got a series of future webinars coming up. We've got Badgers in November and Biodiversity Net Gain in December. So please check those out and register if you might be interested in seeing those and attending. And the other thing, as always, is to promote the Planning Networks for Nature. So if you've got any concerns about development that may impact nature and you want some further advice, or would like to run any queries past a kind of community that's got a lot of experience with that, then please join the Kent or Sussex Planning Networks for Nature. I think most people on this call are already part of that, which is fantastic. I haven't seen that Murray's put his hand up or anyone else with questions. So if no one has anything further, I will wrap it up, but I will make this recording available on the networks. And as always, if anyone thinks of anything afterwards, please drop a line and I will make sure Mike comes back to you on those queries. And finally, just a massive thanks, Mike. It's been great hearing from you. Thank you for sparing the time, and thanks to everybody who could join us this evening.
Okay. Thanks a lot.